Today we are going to deal with a very special process, a very important process, that is the pollination. So what is the word meaning of pollination? Pollination is the transfer of the pollen grains from anther to the stigma of a flower. You know, anther is the part of the stamen. Stamen is the part of the male reproductive structure, that is the androecium. In the androecium, there are so many stamen, and in the stamen, the anther is forming. See, the anther. So this is the stamen. Stamen. So this is the stamen. Stamen having the filament, and the filament at the end of the filament having the anther containing the pollen grains. Okay, and these pollen grains transfer from the anther after dehiscence of the anther, after breaking the anther, the pollen grains are coming outside, and these pollen grains are falling on the stigma. Stigma is the part of the carpel or the pistil, or the part of the female reproductive structure, that is the gynoecium. The gynoecium having the pistil, and each pistil having the ovary, style, and stigma. So these pollen grains are falling on the stigma somehow is known as what is pollination. So pollination is, generally we say that pollination is the transfer of the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the flower. It may be on the same flower, or it may be on the different flower of the same plant, or it may be on the different flower present on the another plant of the same species, or it may be the different species. Okay, so whatever the condition may be, the falling of the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower is known as the pollination. So that is a definition for the pollination. Okay, and this pollination are the different types. So what are the different types of the pollination? Let us study the different type of the pollination. So the different type of the pollination are classified according to the source of the source of the pollen grains. The pollination are classified into different type. One of the type is known as the autogamy. So the first type of the pollination, it is known as the autogamy. So what is autogamy? Let us study that autogamy. So what are the different type? Let us take the list of the different type of the pollination. So one of the type of the pollination is the autogamy. Another type of pollination is called the getonogamy. Getonogamy. Okay, and the third type is known as the xenogamy. Third is known as the xenogamy. And one more type that is not given in the NCERT textbook, that is the hybridization, xenogamy. And the fourth type is the hybridization, that is actually artificial one, so it is not given in the NCERT textbook. Hybridization, we already studied the hybridization mechanism, or the experiment, how the hybridization can be done. Hybridization. Okay, these are the four different type of the pollination. Out of this, the hybridization we are not going to study here. We will study the autogamy, getonogamy, and xenogamy. So first take what is the autogamy. Auto means self. Autogamy. Gamy means gamy means the falling of the pollen grains on the stigma, that is known as the gamy. The word meaning gamy. Auto means self. So the autogamy taken place. Autogamy is related with the same flower, or it is related with the one flower. So see here, suppose this is the flower, and this is the pedicel of the flower, and here is the thalamus, and on the thalamus, calyx, so the calyx, and then the corolla is present here. So this is the corolla. So this is the corolla. Second word is known as the corolla, and then the third word, that is known as the androecium. So this is the androecium having the anther. Different anthers are present. And in the center you can see the innermost wall, that is known as the gynoecium. The gynoecium having the ovary, then the style, it is known as a style, and at the tip you can see the stigma. Okay, so the pollen grains of the one flower. So here the pollen grains are produced. These are the pollen grains, and these pollen grains is coming and falling on the stigma of the same flower. This is known as the autogamy. Okay, autogamy means the pollination taken place within the same flower. That is the pollen grains falling from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. That is known as the autogamy. Okay, but the pure autogamy is very rare in the nature. Sorry, actually, pure autogamy is very rare. Why the pure autogamy is very rare in the nature? Because of for the autogamy to be taken place, the stigma and the anther both must be mature at the same time. Okay, that is known as a synchronization. Synchronization of the receptivity of the stigma and the maturity of the anther means the pollen grains both must be taken place at the same time. Then only the self pollination, or it is known as autogamy, will take place. Another reason, this anther and the stigma must be like close to each other. If anther is present very distant and the stigma is also distant, the pollen grains cannot pollen on the stigma of the same flower. So these two conditions restrict the number of the autogamy very less in the nature. So why the autogamy is very less in the nature? Because autogamy requiring synchronization of the maturity of the pollen grains for anther and the maturity or the receptivity of the stigma both must be synchronized. Synchronized means it must take place at a time. So that is rarely taken place in the nature. At the same time, another reason is that both the anther and stigma must be very close to each other. So because these two are very rare in the nature, and autogamy is also very rare. So complete autogamy is very rare in the nature. But some plants, like I will take some plants like viola. So one of the plant is the viola. Viola plant and oxalis plant, viola, oxalis and commelina. Oxalis and commelina. Commelina means groundnut. Commelina is the groundnut. In this plant, complete autogamy is possible. Why in this plant complete autogamy is possible? Because in this plant, two types of the flowers are produced. The flowers are two types. So what are the two types of flowers? See, it produce this plant producing two types of the flower. One of the flower is known as the chasmogamous flower. Chasmogamous. What is the difference between these two type of flowers that we will study here? Chasmogamous. Another type of flower is known as the clistogamous flower. Clistogamous. So what is the difference between these two flowers? In this plant, suppose this is the plant. So this is the plant with the root. Sorry, this is the stem, and here is the leaf, etc. As like a natural plant, other plants it producing the leaf, the node, and apical bud, axillary bud, everything is there, just like a natural plant. Then see, this is the root of the plant, and the root producing root nodule in the case of the groundnut or the commelina. So here the flower, suppose this flower, it produces the flower, and this flower is completely open. So here the anther or the androecium and the gynoecium is exposed, very well exposed. So here this flower that open completely, and the androecium and the gynoecium is well exposed, that is known as the chasmogamous flower. See, in the chasmogamous flower, just like I told, the pollen grains of the anther is falling on the stigma of the same flower. It is a possibility. So there may be a possibility some of the insect visiting and the pollen grains taken from the another plant also may be falling on the stigma. So here complete autogamy is impossible in this case of the flower. And the same plant producing another type of the flower. See here, what is the flower? It is producing a branch. So this is the branch, and this branch is bending downward, and it will move into the soil. And in the soil, it is producing a bud. So this is the bud. So this is the floral bud, and this floral bud, or when it mature, the floral bud mature, it cannot open. See, it cannot open. That means the anther present inside, and it is producing the pollen grains, and the stigma also present inside. So both the stigma and anther maturing at the same time, or it may be little different, but the flower cannot open. So if a flower cannot open, the anther of that flower must falling on the stigma of the same flower. It is a definite. So in the case of the commelina or oxalis, viola, in the case of the clistogamous flower, the pollination autogamy is 100% assured. But in the case of the chasmogamous flower, it is not 100% assured. Okay, but the case of the commelina, that is a groundnut, we are using this groundnut or the shengdana. So this can be groundnut can be used and this is the autogamous product. The product is the autogamous, so it is a self-pollinating product. So autogamy is a rare in the nature, but in some flower like Viola, Oxalis, and Commelina, the autogamy is possible because the presence of the clistogamous flower. The flower cannot open, so it cannot open, or if open, the pollination taken place before. So actually, it cannot open. So such a flower is known as the clistogamous flower. Okay. Then the next type, let us see the next type, that is the geitonogamy. What is actually geitonogamy? Geitonogamy. So next type is the geitonogamy. In the case of the clear difference, you see the difference. In the case of the geitonogamy, the pollen grains or the anther or the pollen grains from the one flower is falling on the stigma of the another flower present on the same plant. Okay. So here, suppose I will explain the same thing in this plant. So here there are two flowers. Two flowers. So this is the one flower, and this is the another flower. Here is the anther, and the stigma is present here. Here is the anther. So here the pollen grains, it produces the pollen grains, and this pollen grains falling on the stigma of the another flower present on the same plant. So see here, this is known as geitonogamy. So geitonogamy means the falling or pollination taken place between the two flowers present on the same plant. The pollen grains from the anther of the one flower falling on the stigma of the another flower present on the same plant, that is known as the geitonogamy. Okay, so that is the difference between the autogamy and geitonogamy. Then say the third type, that is known as the genogamy. So what is the genogamy? Genogamy means the pollination between the two flowers. Definitely there are two flowers, but the pollination taken place between the two plant flower present on the different plant. Suppose here is another plant, so this is another plant. Okay, and here it produces the leaf and the nodes, etc. as usual. Okay, and here present a flower. Suppose here is a flower. Here is the anther and stigma. Here it produces the pollen grains. Okay, or it may be produced here, produce the pollen grains. Okay, and this pollen grains falling on the stigma of the another flower present on the another plant of the same species. See the difference? The pollen grains from the anther of a flower falling on the stigma of the another flower present on the another plant of the same species, then we say that it is the genogamy. So what is the difference between geitonogamy and genogamy? In the case of the geitonogamy, the pollen grains are falling on the stigma of the another flower of the same plant, and in the genogamy, the pollen grains of a flower falling on the stigma of the another plant of the same species. Then see here, in the case of the geitonogamy, to fall the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the another flower, it is requiring a pollinating agent. So it may be a wind, or it may be water, or it may be some animals. These animals, wind or water, take the pollen grains, and the pollen grains will fall here. So this is requiring the pollinating agent, and in one way this is actually cross pollination, because the pollination taken place between the two flowers, even though it is present on the same plant. So it is genetically similar to autogamy. So it is genetically similar to autogamy. So because it is related with the same plant, genetically similar to the autogamy, but practically it is the cross pollination. Okay, practically cross pollination. Genetically it is autogamy because it is related with the same plant. Okay, but in the case of the genogamy, it is a practically and genetically also it is a different. Both the plants are different, so it is entirely different. So it is known as a cross pollination. Cross pollination. Genogamy is exactly cross pollination because it is related with the two plants. Even though it is a different plants of the same species, it is a clearly it is a cross pollination. So that is the three different type of the pollination: autogamy, geitonogamy, and genogamy. Then let us study something about the pollinating agent. So different pollinating agent required. So what is actually pollinating agent? Let us clear the meaning of the pollinating agent first. Pollinating agent. Okay, so agent, agent means it is a mediocre. Mediocre, it is helping to pollination. So the pollinating agent means the agent which is helping for the pollination is known as a pollinating agent. See, in the case of the geitonogamy, the pollen grains are transferred from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the another flower. So for that, a mediocre is requiring. So the madhyastha, a mediocre is requiring. That a mediocre is known as the agent. And similarly, in the case of the genogamy, the pollen grains from the one plant, the flower present on the one plant is transferring on the stigma of the another flower present on the another plant. Definitely it requires some of the agent for the transferring the pollen grains. So that is the pollinating agent. The agent which is requiring for the transfer of the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower is known as the pollinating agent. And this pollinating agent are two types. So what are the two types? One of the type is the abiotic agent. Abiotic agent. One type is the abiotic agent, and another type is known as the biotic agent. Biotic agent. So what is the word meaning? Abiotic agent and biotic agent. Abiotic agent means non-living things. So what is actually non-living things which is helping for the pollination? Non-living things. That is the wind and water. Wind and water are the two important non-living things which are helping for the pollination. Wind and water. Okay. Then what is the biotic agent? Biotic agent means living. And this living agent most commonly living agent most commonly animals, different type of animals. We will study this biotic agent in the next lecture, and now today we will study the abiotic agent, that is a non-living wind and water. So let us take so if you compare the percentage of the abiotic agent and the biotic agent, abiotic agent is very less. So as a pollinating agent, abiotic is very less. But the biotic agent, plants depending on the biotic agent for the pollination, near about 90% pollination taken place by the biotic agent, and less amount percentage is depending on the abiotic agent, that is the wind and water. Okay. Uh, so one of the so let us study the abiotic agent. Abiotic agent. So I told abiotic agent means it may be wind or it may be water. So in both the condition, what happens? The pollen grains are brought to the stigma through the wind. So when it moving through the wind, most of the pollen grains will fall down. So there is a great loss of the pollen grains when pollen grains are taken place through the wind. And similarly, through the water, when the water is flowing, the pollen grains are falling on the stigma. So here also a great chance of the loss of the pollen grains. To compensate that, the plants are producing large amount of the pollen grains comparing to the uh, ovule or comparing to the carpels. In a plant, carpels are very limited, but the pollen grains are the thousands or more than thousand. So, see, if the question asking related with this, you must say that pollen grains, loss of the pollen grains is great in the case of the wind pollination and water pollination. So the plants that depending on the wind or the water, it produces a great number of the large number of the pollen grains comparing to the number of the female reproductive system, that is the gynoecium or the carpels or the ovule. Okay, so let us study the wind pollination. Wind pollination. Wind pollination. The pollination taken place by the wind. It is not also known as the anemophily. Anemo means wind. Anemophily. Technically, it is also known as the anemophily. So in the case of the most common abiotic, this is the most common. Wind, this is the most common. Okay, comparing to the water and wind, wind is the most common. Water very less. So this is the most common type. And pollen grains, light pollen grains. The pollen grains are very light. Why the pollen grains are light? Because uh, it has to bring through the wind pollen grains, light pollen grains. So through the wind, if the pollen grains are very heavy, it will fall down very easily. So pollen grains are very light. so it can easily transfer through the wind. Okay, and third character of this plant, they have well exposed stamen. Stamen is a well exposed. Stamen means the individual part of the androecium is known as the stamen. It is a well exposed. Why it is well exposed? Because when the pollen grains mature, the anther will break and the pollen grains will take by the wind, and through the wind the pollen grains will move in to the next the stigma of another flower. So stamen is well exposed. So in the higher position it is well exposed. Next, the stigma. If you study the stigma, the nature of the stigma is a feathery. In this plant, the stigma is feathery. Why the stigma is a feathery? So this is, suppose this is the stigma. The stigma is a feathery because if the stigma is a feathery, the pollen grains that are coming through the wind that will stick here and there, or the block here and there, and the pollination can take place very easily. So stigma is a feathery. It's another character of the this plant, wind pollinating plant. Another character, most of the wind pollinating plant have single ovule. So for example, rice, jowar, maize, etc. Single ovule. Only one seed producer, that is a single ovule. Ovule change into seed. Okay. So next character of this plant, flowers are not colorful. So no, not colorful flowers. Flowers are very not attractive, colorful. Why it is not attractive? It is not colorful because it has not attract the insect. It is not necessary to attract the insect, so the flower is not colorful. As a result, it is an economic. Okay, flowers are packed in inflorescence. If small flowers are the flowers are producing the inflorescence. A group of the flowers that is known as the inflorescence. So easily pollination can take place. Inflorescence. So these are the some of the character of the wind pollinating plant. So then let us study the water pollinating plant. What are the characters of the water pollinating plant? Water pollination. Water pollination is also known as the hydrophily. Hydro means water pollination, or it is known as the hydrophily. It is known as the hydrophily. So it is a rare actually. The hydrophily, water pollination, is very rare. It is not a well widely distributed plant. It is restricted only some plants only. Near about 30 genera. Water pollination is found only 30 genera. It is a very less. 30 genera means a very minor quantity. And mostly the plants are the monocotyledon plants. See the difference? It is a monocotyledon plants. Cotyledon, single cotyledon plant, monocotyledon plants. So water pollination is restricted to 30 genera, and most of the plants are the monocotyledon plants. Then see, we studied in the algae, bryophyte and pteridophyte. Algae requiring water for the pollination, for the fertilization, not pollination, fertilization. The pollination is otherwise known as this is the first part of the fertilization. Without pollination, fertilization is impossible. So in the case of the algae and bryophyte, we studied the bryophyte, and also in the case of the pteridophyte plant. In these plants, water is very essential. Pteridophyte. So in these three plants, these are the cryptogamous plant, non-flowering plant. In these plants, water is very essential for the pollination. Without water, pollination or the fertilization cannot take place. Because hence the gamete present in these plants, gametes, the male gamete present, male gamete. Okay, the male gamete in these plants are the motile. Motile, they have flagella for the locomotion. Motile, because they have to swim through the water and reach to the archegonium or the female sex organ for the fertilization. That is the reason why these plants, algae, bryophyte, pteridophyte, is very limited in the nature. See, algae, you cannot see the algae everywhere. Bryophyte also cannot see everywhere. Pteridophyte is also restricted to only a particular place on the earth. It is because to complete the life cycle of the bryophyte, pteridophyte, requiring the water. Because the gametes are flagellated, it has to swim and reach up to the female reproductive structure. So these plants are restricted. The distribution is restricted in the nature. If a question asking for the NEET examination, you must remember this point. Okay. Then Pure hydrophyte plant is very less. Pure hydrophyte. Because some of the plant which is actually hydrophyte, for example, the lotus plant. See the difference? Lotus plant and water hyacinth plant, water hyacinth. Gel pernimanthopum, water hyacinth. So in this plant, lotus plant, water hyacinth plant, etc. Hyacinth and lily plant. Another one is the lily plant. In this plant, this is actually what is aquatic plant. All these are the aquatic plant. But in this plant, pollination is not taken place by the water. It's very important. The pollination taken place either by the wind or pollination taken place by insect. So it's very important. This question asked for in the 2012 NEET examination. Okay, in the case of the lotus, in the case of the water hyacinth, lily plant, etc. There are a lot of plants. In this plant, pollination is not taken place by, even though these plants are the aquatic, pollination not taken place by water. The pollination taken place by wind or the insect. Okay, so complete pollination seen in some of the plant. For example, Vallisneria, complete pollination. Vallisneria. The complete pollination taken place by water. Hydrilla, another plant is the hydrilla. Hydrilla plant. Another plant is the juster, the marine seagrass. Marine. Marine seagrass, it is known as the Justera. In this plant, Vallisneria, hydrilla, marine seagrass or Justera, complete pollination taken place. Complete is totally depending on the aquatic medium. So complete aquatic. These are the complete aquatic pollinator. Complete aquatic pollinator or water pollinator. Aquatic pollinator. Okay. It living, it present in the water, and the pollination also taken place by the aquatic medium or the water pollinator. Complete pollinator. These are the plants, Vallisneria, hydrilla, and the marine water. So see the Vallisneria. In the case of the Vallisneria, how the pollination taken place? Vallisneria. In the case of the Vallisneria, the pollen grains are falling on the surface of the water. So this is the surface of the water. These are the pollen grains. Okay. So this is the surface of the water. The pollen grains are producing and it floating on the surface of the water. Okay. At the same time, the gynoecium is reaching up to the the stigma. The stigma is reaching up to the surface, and when the pollen grains is moving along with the water waves, it accidentally touching on the stigma and the pollination taking place. Okay. So that is the nature of the pollination in the case of the Vallisneria. So what is the case? So this is called the pollination taken place on the surface of the water. So in the case of the Vallisneria, it is known as the epihydrophily. So this hydrophily also two types. This is known as the epihydrophily. Epi means above. Water surface, the pollination taken place on the water surface. Epihydrophily. This is known as epihydrophily. Then another one, that is the Justera. Justera. In the Justera plant, the plant is actually submerged plant. Submerged plant means the plant totally present inside the water. Submerged plant. Completely present inside the water, within the water. Submerged. So it is not a submerged plant. So in this case, the pollen grains are produced, and these pollen grains are needle shaped, like this, needle shaped pollen grains. So just like this, needle shaped pollen grains, and the stigma produced, the stigma has a coiled style, and then the stigma is present here. So this coil will become uncoiled and reaching to the stigma, and this pollen grains and the pollen grains coiling around this stigma, and the pollination will take place here. So that is a submerged. So it is known as this type of the pollination is known as the hypohydrophily. This is epihydrophily, and this is known as the hypohydrophily. Hypo means below. Hypohydrophily. So that is the method of the pollination in the case of the Justera hydrophily. So the pollen grains is a needle-like, And in both the epihydrophilus and the hypohydrophily plant, the pollen grains are having the waxy coating. So this waxy coating protects the pollen grains from the aquatic medium. Okay, so these are the different type of the abiotic agent and the type of the pollination. So today we studied what is pollination, what are the different type of the pollination, and what are the different, what is the pollinating agent, what are the different type of the pollinating agent. So out of this pollinating agent, we completely covered the abiotic pollinating agent and the different types. Tomorrow we will study the biotic agent and the different types. Okay, thank you.